Meshell, who serves as a spokesperson for the organization Young Americans for Liberty. So Emma, I'm really glad to have you on the program tonight because just recently we passed 100 days of violence in the city of Portland. Looking at what we're seeing right now, the evidence that is put in front of us and the situation in Portland, do you think that there's any end in sight?
It doesn't feel like it because the police have been continually refusing to address this in the way that it should be addressed. And there's actually a new poll that just came out this week where Portlanders were actually asked their thoughts about this in the broader range of issues that are facing Oregon. And 66% of people saw these protests as the number one issue that needed to be addressed by state and local government, even higher than COVID-19. And these are folks that tend to be extremely liberal. If you look at the electoral data, Portland is a very left-leaning place, and it has been for a long time. And what that tells you is that people see this as a non-political issue now. It's an issue of safety, of looking out for their families, and frankly, looking out for businesses and job opportunities, because businesses are not going to want to stick around if this continues. So this is something that's very dear to my heart. I grew up here in Portland. This is my hometown. I'm here right now visiting family, and it's horrible to see this city be destroyed by people who seem to not actually care about finding real solutions or pushing for criminal justice reform. They just want to see the city burn.
And even before the George Floyd protests, I think it's worth noting that there were acts of violence occurring in Portland from Antifa long before. In fact, I remember covering, for example, lawyers for ICE agents, other people in the area, immigration lawyers that were getting their offices flooded, just vandalized, things of that nature. It was existing before the George Floyd protests. But now Portland has turned into a sort of a proxy war, if you will, that kind of demonstrates the possibility that the far left could present and what the Trump administration is trying to do. And it comes in an election cycle, which is a little bit unfortunate in my eyes that politics has to get in the way because, as you said, it's not so much about politics. It's about the idea of safety and security in our nation's cities. And right now, for example, Mayor Ted Wheeler, he's been a victim of some of that violence. He's moving out from his apartment, yet his moves seem to be a little bit more of platitudes than anything else. For example, following that violence outside of his apartment, he banned tear gas in the city outright, saying that that is the type of response he wants. What is the more communal, I would say, response, apart from the protesters, when it comes to Mayor Ted Wheeler?
People are very disappointed in his leadership, to be honest with you, and he's been flip-flopping so much on these issues. He doesn't have the left support anymore, and he certainly has not had conservative support, or people in the suburbs, even people with kids and families who tend to be a little more on the conservative or moderate side of things. And it's because he's been trying to make everybody happy and just sort of go with the tides. But the thing is, in Portland, if you're continually going with the tides and you're trying to do whatever's going to make everyone the most happy and make you a celebrity rather than a strong leader, you're going to end up with 100 days straight of protests. And like you talked about a little bit, there have always been protests, at least in the last few years here in Portland. But the fact that this violence, these assaults on innocent people, and even deaths have gone largely unpunished and unnoticed by city leadership, it's been the federal government that's had to step in, unfortunately. That is being noticed by these residents and by people. And if you talk to, 100 Portlanders and ask them, are you going to stay here? What's it going to take to keep you here? A lot of them would probably tell you, I'm thinking about going somewhere else. And that seems to be what I've noticed among my friends and family, but just also among other residents at large. They're tired of the violence. They're tired of fearing for their physical safety and tired of wondering if their businesses and if their employers are going to be able to stick around. And that also comes from the far left Marxist leadership that has been here that punishes business, it punishes success, and it paints capitalism as something that's evil. And all it does is reward this type of behavior that we get from these Marxist, Antifa, BLM type movements.
And you raise a good point because it's not just Portland where there's an exodus of people because of the unsafe situations. I mean, we've talked to people on this program from Seattle, New York, Washington, D.C., where they too say, you know what, if my local officials aren't going to take action on something such as businesses being burned down, that's not a community that I want to be living in right now. So it does also pose an interesting question as to what's the end game here? We know that demonstrators are taking to the streets in the name of social justice, but a lot of people would say that's not what's really going on in the city of Portland, for example. So is there anything, any sort of action that could get these individuals content and off the streets? Or is this something where you might have to get rid of this through the legal process or through use of force through police or something of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, their demands are completely unclear. If you were to go Google, what does Portland Antifa want, you're not going to find a clear answer. And if you asked 100 people in that crowd, they probably would all tell you different things. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about these protests, which is that maybe at one point they began as a way to voice concern for what I believe is a legitimate cause. It's important to hold police accountable and make sure that, the good cops, the ones that are doing their jobs, are protected. But at the end of the day, this has gone so far off the rails, and it has become about harming people. It's become about violence, setting fires, and destroying property. That's an eye for an eye. And that's not how we find justice. And it's not how we move forward as a nation. Ultimately, this is dividing us. This is further tearing us apart. And if people really expect this to move us forward toward a place of reconciliation, they're so far gone that I don't know if we'll ever be able to have those productive discussions. So what it's going to take is people stepping down and ending this violence if we're ever going to come to a solution and actually figure out what it is they want and how we can move forward as a country.
I think you're right, because if you look on Capitol Hill, there was a moment where it looked like there were going to be police reforms. Republicans and Democrats seemed to have some sort of bill that would at least improve the conditions that both sides were looking at. But of course, for the sake of politics, it was sidelined, and no longer is that looking like it's going to happen before November. But there was a time where many people were on board with police reforms. But as soon as people saw exactly what was happening on the streets, Americans are smart enough to know that this was not about criminal justice or police reforms. And I think that has hindered any real progress from taking place. But Emma, Meshell, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight, breaking down what is happening in the streets of Portland. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.